Thanks for joining me in this segment of Belly Flopping into Mysticism. My name is Penny Colpin, and with this YouTube channel, I am exploring how to describe basically falling into non-ordinary states of consciousness and what a struggle that can be. That happened to me several years ago, and unfortunately there aren't a lot of people, even in the mental health system, who really understand what that is, what that feels like, the goofiness, the just weirdness that can happen. Um, I always forget, so I'm going to do this up front, that if you like what I'm trying to do, feel free to subscribe. Doesn't cost you anything. Like, share, help build up an audience. Because as I'm continuing to reach out to people to do interviews with, or actually to interview for this channel, having higher numbers does help a little bit. So I appreciate your help in that. In this segment, what I'd like to talk about is a term that I made up based on my own experiences. I've come to call it an experience base. The terminology comes from, the base part is similar to a database. Now, I have a master's degree in statistics. I have a second master's in German, which goes to kind of the translational language side of things. But of course, the statistics part is heavily analytical. And so it's natural that as I went through my experience, I might try and apply kind of statistical concepts, mathematical concepts, analytical elements. And even when I was in Banff in 1998, going through the initial stages of this what I've always called a severe stress breakdown, there were experiences that I'd had years and even decades earlier. I was 31 at the time, but as a little girl, these memories would come flying out. It seemed like flying out of nowhere. And it actually took me a while to realize that is part of what I'd call a database of how I operate in this world, based on what I learned, based on the language I learned, the role I played in my family. I grew up with 3 older brothers. How we learn to relationally deal with each other, but also with things, how you learn colors, how you learn various things. And so even for me, just having these memories of whether it was walking along the street with my dad holding his pinky in my little hand, or something about the Beatles, which my middle brother played the Beatles incessantly the first few years of my life. Um, these pieces would come flying out at me. But it wasn't until about 2018 or so that I decided to call it an experience base, because let's back up here. With a database, it's basically contents. It could be numerical contents, it could be sentences, uh, verbal contents, and you build out different things. A simple example I use is that of an address book, or a personal phone book. You have your list of contacts. You might have a first name, a last name, their address, their cell number. You might have where they work or how you know them. If you know them well, you might include their birth date in there. Okay, so that's just a simple database. Excel spreadsheets are simple forms of databases. Well, if you think of our experiences and how they accumulate over years, from when we're young babies, toddlers, growing up into elementary school, we have this set of experiences that it's really more than just the data, that there's emotion related to it, there's meaning related to it. But how that material ends up structured together is what I would call an experience base. And as a statistician, one thing I've tried to grasp is just the immense amount of variability in these things. My history is so completely different and so completely variable from anyone else's, even members of my own family. So even though we might share a vacation together, if my youngest brother is 6 years older than me, the meaning he attaches to it is different than mine. How he experiences it based on a souvenir he got or something like that still has different impact in this overall, what I call an experience base. Now, when I was in Banff, one of the things that happened is I mean, I remember feeling how frustrating it was to try and put together words in a cohesive sentence. So like for me to do that now is more natural. It's subconscious, is processing the language and whatever. I'm not thinking about it. What word do I want next? What word do I want after that? And so on. But in Banff, when I was going through these initial stages of this breakdown, I had to actually mentally concentrate on that. And I remember at one night, one evening in the motel room, really struggling with this. And it felt like the normal neural paths. It was like a forest with a bunch of paths through it. And it had been windblown, and all these trees had blown down over the normal paths that I use. And so instead of being able to go from point A to point B using this certain path, that was all covered and all blocked. And instead, I had to go from point A over here to point C, over here to point F, to point T, and then back to point B. And I had to knock trees down along the way. And I could relate this point to something else, to something else, to something else, and then get finally to where I wanted to go. And as I thought about this concept of an experience base, it's kind of like I have this data in this table, and normally I just go and query it, or it's related in the next column. But instead, I had to go over here and over here and over here and over here to make all these connections. And the most amazing thing about it was that I could do that. And of course, at each node, there are multiple dimensions that I had to choose from to get to head to the direction that I wanted to make these connections. But that was kind of, I didn't describe it like that as part of an experience base at the time, but it was those neural channels trying to go and find the data that it needed, that it was seeking. And in that sense, it's kind of like querying a database. That type of thing. And so even this concept of not being able to work within this structure that I had developed, that my subconscious works on all the time, that when I look outside and I see this plant growing, it's large and has what we call a trunk on it, and I know to call it a tree instead of a Baum, which is what they would call it in German. And I don't know what else they'd call it in other languages, but that's all part of this experience base. It's a referential system of how I navigate in this world. Well, in some sense, I have a separate segment that I released about ego and ego collapse, that this experience base could be considered related to an ego. I don't necessarily believe it's identical. As I mentioned in the ego segment, ego is a very abstract, kind of gooey thing. Is it mind? Is it this? Is it that? And for me, the idea of an experience base puts a little structure to it, that how babies relate these things and the content of what they're dealing with, it's a theory, but there's structure to it. And of course, that ends up being the foundational way that we operate in this world. And in and of itself, if there's a lot of trauma in a young child, that could affect how it gets stored, the meaning attached to it, of course. And it affects the foundational way that people operate in this world. And so if you're familiar with something called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, I forget who developed that. It was back in, I think, the late 70s or early 80s through a insurance HMO. But, these are cases where young children have, parents who have died, or parents who've been incarcerated, or there's been violence in their family, which, some people call that big T trauma. That would definitely affect how this material gets stored and related so that you could function in this world. That's my take anyway. And just as in this terms of ego collapse, that would be an example of this experience base kind of fracturing apart, where the pieces that are most closely related are no longer related. So for example, in the case of a phone, personal phone book, address book, or whatever, where you would normally have your first name, last name, maybe email address, phone number, birthday or whatever, and those would all be in one row, those pieces would all end up in different places. And so I might find the piece that says Penny, but then Colpin is way off over here somewhere. And so trying to navigate when this experience base falls apart or collapses, either it explodes or implodes, it falls apart. And for those of you who've dealt with databases, you could say in that sense, people use the term corrupted, the indexes no longer work or whatever. I wouldn't say it like that. I would just say it fell apart for whatever reason, too much stress, too much strain, over processing, what have you. That concept actually kind of falls in line with this idea of an ego collapse, in that structure of how these experiences relate to one another and how a person cognitively uses them. They can't do that in that state. So again, that's just a concept I came up with. And to me, part of what I like about it is it provides a little bit more structure to what I think is going on during this type of process, or at least my type of process. So hopefully that gives you something to think about, and maybe it resonates with you, maybe it doesn't. But I also think that it helps establish kind of this concept of layers of the psyche, depths of the psyche, and the concept of building how we function in this world. It also begins to address so much from what I've seen. There's an effort to try and understand what these processes are. Well, sometimes they don't even try and understand the process. They just want to call it an illness and medicate it. But to me, there's a process involved, that of shattering or exploding or imploding. That's the structure part. But then there's also the contents part of this stuff that had either been shoved off in the shadow or is in the deeper parts of this experience base that bubble up that you haven't thought of. And that's what makes it so difficult or so challenging going through this type of experience. And I just thought I'd share that because to me, it's like, wow, that provides a little bit more structure to, I believe, how we operate in this realm. And it also helps acknowledge that we aren't all working from the same experience base. We're not all working from the same database. We're all working from parts of a collective whole. So it's worth considering. Just wanted to throw it out there, at least for consideration. And yeah, again, if you go ahead and subscribe or click like, share with people. But I hope ultimately this has been of some value to you and provides something interesting to mull over. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Thanks so much for joining me.